Hello, welcome again. We are starting Unit 2 in Art Appreciation, Section 2, and we are beginning with a discussion about ancient civilizations. When we left off, we talked about the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic, and you can think of Neolithic in a way as the starting point, the first foundation for ancient civilizations, because it's the establishment of a settled agricultural society in many parts of the world. And then in certain parts of the world, we see a transition into something that um, historians have called civilization. Basically, civilization, the word, comes from the Greek word for city, and so that's kind of the starting point. The idea of not just living in settled towns, in farming communities, but in full cities. And like I say on the title here, that cities are about walls. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at Egyptian art and what it tells us about ancient Egyptian society, and we're going to be looking at ancient Mesopotamian. Although this first part will probably take us just to the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. Okay, we're ready to begin. So first of all, defining civilization, and this is a lot of testable kind of information here and things to think about. When exactly civilization begins is hard to define, and it definitely is a different date for different parts of the world. But maybe the earliest is somewhere around 3,500 to 3,000 BCE, somewhere in there. And the places in the world where civilization began first include Mesopotamia, and definitely Egypt, and also India and China. In India, in the Indus Valley, and in China, actually in lots of different places. There were lots of Neolithic towns kind of on the verge of civilization in vast different parts of China. So, like I said before, the starting point for civilization is cities. So, cities, not towns. And one of the main differences about cities is that they tend to be fortified. They have walls surrounding them. And another major difference about cities is just because of their scale, life in the cities and labor in the cities is more specialized. Um, the jobs that people do are more distinct, and so then people are defined by their roles, as opposed to being, let's say, a leader of a town, but you also participate in the hunting and in the farming and in the jobs that most everyone else participates. Um, in this version of, you know, of society, in these kind of civilized, and we use that not as a positive necessarily term, but in these kinds of cities, some people are farmers and that's just what they do, and some people are warriors and that's just what they do, and some people are members of the priestly class and that is their sole job. Um, so also we see writing and record keeping in these cities, and also the development of new types of crafts, uh, including glass making. We talked about how in the Neolithic period we'd already seen the pretty prevalent use of pottery, but crafts kind of spread beyond ceramics in this time period to metal, bronze making, glass, and we also see higher or uh, more complicated forms of political organizations, starting with city-states. So since the city is the prime root of civilization, but the city-states also are organized into kingdoms. That's usually where one city-state is kind of considered the most important one of a set of cities, and that then they are organized by the king of that one primary city-state. And then that eventually becomes the idea of empires. An empire is different from a kingdom because in a kingdom it's kind of assumed that all the people, all those different cities, are all basically the same people, same culture, and speak the same language. Whereas in an empire, that is not the case at all. So back to ancient Egypt specifically. Um, People were living in ancient Egypt, Neolithic communities, proto-civilized communities as early as 6,000, or maybe even earlier, but definitely by 6,000 BCE. Um, and somewhere around 3200 BCE to 3100 BCE, we see We see Egypt developing into city-states where they then are organized into two primary kingdoms, the Upper and Lower Egypt. And Lower Egypt was the northern Nile, and and then yeah, Upper Egypt was the Delta. And these two, eventually these two kingdoms unified. As to when exactly they unified is a little bit uh, not clear, but we have this one object, the Palette of Namur, that seems to argue that it happened somewhere around 3100 BCE. It doesn't have a date on it, but in terms of its, our dating of it, it seems to be 3100 BCE, and clearly the king on it seems to be claiming that he unified the two kingdoms, or not necessarily clearly to you, but clearly to Egyptologists because of the kind of crowns that he's wearing. He's wearing crowns that show both the crown of Upper and the crown of Lower Egypt. Um, and this particular object is really, really important to people who study ancient Egypt and very important in the study of art history, and will be very important to our class for a couple of reasons. One is that it's because of that art historical and that historical importance, it kind of defined the beginning of ancient Egypt as an older time period, gave an older date than people had thought before. It created more knowledge about the pre-dynastic period, or rather, we'll call it the pre-dynastic, but it is also a dynasty, and something about how Egypt was unified. But also as an art object, this particular piece will be used multiple times in the class to talk about things like relief sculpture, low relief. It is an example of low relief, and we'll talk about that more in the next unit. In terms of scale, the use of scale, scale to create hierarchy, we'll talk about that later on in the semester. So keep in mind, pay attention to this. For now, the main things you need to know about it are that it is actually a palette. It was probably used for the mixing of makeup, whether ceremonial makeup, whether it was for ceremonial like in life or for funerary ceremonial makeup. It's not quite clear. Probably the second one, because most of Egyptian culture was focused on funerary things having to do with burial. And also that it is it's an object that describes sort of an event of the unification where one king conquers both kingdoms and unifies them together. And Namur goes from being the king of Upper Egypt to being the king of a unified Egypt. Like I said, there's a lot of debate about this. Many people are not sure whether Namur's unification lasted and that maybe there was a second unification. Some people think that unification was done by a different figure, Menes. There's other archaeologists and Egyptologists who argue that Menes and Namur were the same person. This is all very interesting, and you can read more about it on lots of different sites, Khan Academy and Wikipedia, I'm sure. But just if you can know that it is, as I said, a palette that describes this kind of achievement by this pharaoh Namur, that would be enough. And one of the other things I want to say is that's really interesting about this is that this is very old, but it really kind of shows that the Egyptian style of picture making, of organizing imagery, which eventually becomes the Egyptian style of art making, was already pretty definitely set, and that this quality that we see in a lot of Egyptian art, which is this quality of timelessness of a style that holds true for thousands of years, was actually set even earlier than we had thought. So I'd also like to talk just a little bit more about ancient Egypt in terms of what we said before about the funerary focus of the culture. Now, Egypt was not by any means the only ancient culture. Lots of ancient civilizations, what we see in ancient China, in ancient India, definitely in ancient Mesopotamia. We also see a strong focus on funerary culture, funerary rites, the importance of burying, and that really monolithic or really memorial architecture, very impressive architecture, was often used for large-sized tombs. And of course, probably the most famous example of that is the pyramids of Giza. I have here on the slide both an image of the pyramids of Giza where you're looking at them roughly from the ground, and then one that has kind of a schematic showing you what the complex would have looked like when it was at its most complex. Keeping in mind that this was an architectural project that went on for, many, many, many generations, so that it was constantly changing, constantly being updated, but that gives you kind of a sense. One of the points I want to make about the Egyptian focus on death and funerary, and it was very important to them. It was a center in some ways of their culture, this interest in a life after death and the preparations that you had to make for that life after death. So it was a very important part of the Egyptian life, but it should not be viewed as indicating that Egyptian culture was morbid or death obsessed. In fact, in the funerary art, we see lots of examples, lots of indications that the Egyptians actually strongly believed in living life well, and enjoying life, and that they tried to bring that same kind of joy of life to their idea of the afterlife. I'd already talked about this just a little bit, but I wanted to emphasize one more time with these two particular images, the sense of stability, almost eternal permanence that is in Egyptian art. This was both a really important characteristic of the fact that the Egyptian style making, art making, stayed very, very constant all the way through the Old Kingdom, hardly any change whatsoever, but even into the Middle Kingdom period and the New Kingdom period. In the New Kingdom period, we see somewhat of a kind of like a return to the Old Kingdom style, and then a similar willingness or desire to hold on to that kind of those very set forms for a very long period of time. So that idea of permanence is really, I think, an important part of Egyptian culture. But another aspect is the sense of permanence in the artwork itself. When you look at these statues and you look at the kind of pose that the figures hold, and you look at the type of materials that they use, there is obviously an effort on the part of the sculptors to create a sense of eternalness, that they are not simply just making, these are not just likenesses. In a way, they're not really likenesses at all. They are more, although they may be slightly based on the individual characteristics of each king and queen, they are more focused on showing the universal continuity of every pharaoh to every other pharaoh, and they're more interested in showing the idea that in death these figures become permanent and eternal, so that they are as long-lasting as the stone that they're made out of. They tended to use really, really strong stone for sculptures like this, unlike the Greeks later on we'll talk about, who use marble, which is a soft stone, which therefore allows for making the work pretty fast and making the work very increases the ability to make very subtle decisions. They chose for their statues some of the most hardest stones, for the very purpose, even though that meant sometimes that these things were incredibly long to make and required teams of people to make them. The purpose was to make the impression that these would, and in fact they seem to have, lasted close to forever. So that's the end of part one. We'll get to part two in just a second.